On Tuesday, Mets owner Steve Cohen met with the media and gave his state of address on where things are with the New York Mets. On the show today, I'll be discussing all the different things that he said, but primarily his comment about how one day he'd like to get under the Cohen tax line.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Well, Steve Cohen had his annual address in front of the Mets media on Tuesday. We see this every spring training where he'll have a meeting with Howie Rose on a podcast, which I also checked out. And then there is sort of a general meeting with all of the media. Typically, you'll see Steve Cohen sitting in the dugout instead of in a press room, and he'll take various questions. This time it was about 20 minutes of discussion, and a lot of things were brought up. He talked about how much fun he had last year, how exciting it was, how it really was the most fun he thinks he maybe has ever had, and how excited and fired up he is about the upcoming season. When asked about expectations, he said the expectation is to make the playoffs. And he said that's the minimum. He said they want to get to the World Series and they want to win it. He was asked about Juan Soto and how there was that phrase that was brought up in, I think, Soto's introductory press conference about wanting to win 2 to 4 World Series with Juan Soto. And he basically discussed how that was, a tough goal to reach, but something that the Mets are going to aspire towards, and how if they're in position year after year to compete, they can potentially reach that goal. So there was a lot that was, broached about Soto and the Mets, and, talking about wanting everything in the organization to be excellent, how they've come a long way, but they're still pouring money into different facets of the organization. He talked about how the Mets have gotten where they want to when it comes to being able to develop pitching, but they still aren't quite there yet with developing hitting, and how, investing in new technologies and different things to improve the franchise is always something that's important to him. And he trusts his baseball people to bring those technologies and those, different expenditures, to his table. And he is always willing to continue to make this a first-class organization. Speaking of first-class organizations, he was asked about the Dodgers. He talked about how they have built a great business and how their revenues are significantly higher than any other team, which allows them to spend and allocate those resources. He even talked about deferred money. He said he loves deferring money if he can, but his players just typically don't want the deferred money. He said that with the Dodgers, what he's noticing is they're trying to balance out the deferred money, where they're giving the hefty signing bonuses up front. So they are giving the funds early, and then that really matches up with the money on the back end on the deferred contracts, which is how they are getting around the luxury tax, so to speak. And, Steve Cohen's now part of the executive council for the MLB owners. So he's going to be a big part of the next collective bargaining agreement. He didn't really comment on that much, but he obviously does have, a tightrope to walk in that regard of trying to, focus on the Mets, but also at some point he's going to have to negotiate with the owners on the next CBA. And he was, sort of asked about a salary cap. That was one of the questions. And I thought that was really one of the more interesting answers, where, he didn't really comment on if there should be a salary cap, but when asked if a salary cap will take away his competitive advantage, Steve Cohen said, "I will compete under any circumstance. You tell me the rules, I will compete against them." So those were just some of the little one-hitters I wanted to talk about. Another one actually too is he was asked about building up Willets Point around the ballpark, and this is an important year for that. He says the property has to get rezoned, and once it gets rezoned, they have to win the license. Those are the two steps that he has to, have go the Mets' way for this to actually come to fruition, where the Mets could build up around the ballpark. And he talked about needing an economic engine to make that work. If you're not familiar, the Mets are looking to, basically build up, parking garages, shopping, a casino, all this stuff around the ballpark to really help, create what other teams have, which is a real, economy around, their ballpark. You see it with Wrigleyville with the Cubs. The Braves have done a great job of doing that. I know I was in DC this past year, and the Nationals even have a lot of shopping and restaurants and stuff that are right around the ballpark. So that's obviously a down the line goal for Steve Cohen to have that atmosphere around the ballpark, and we'll see if the Mets get there this year. Another big quote that got a lot of buzz was his disappointment in Mets attendance. Mets were 18th in attendance last year, and he obviously hopes fans show up to the ballpark. He did say that the fans that are in the ballpark seem to be having a blast, and he's really proud of the game day experience, but he is disappointed with the turnout. So Mets fans, show up this year. Of course, you could counter and say, hey, lower those prices a little bit, but I do think this is a ball club that is probably worth those prices to go out and check them out. With all of those different comments that had a various amount of intrigue to them, the biggest running topic throughout the entire session with the media was talking about payroll and spending, because once again, Steve Cohen has spent at a rate that only the Dodgers have matched this offseason. So he was asked about it, and he says it always comes down to ball players being more expensive than you think. He said that, when you talk about payroll growth, he said, I've always wanted to be more measured in payroll growth. I have always had the ability to spend if I have to. I wanted a competitive ball club, but essentially Steve Cohen wants to be measured in his spending, and it's just year after year after year. His want to put a great ball club on the field ultimately trumps that desire to have some type of a budget. And so every single time where he gets to the end of the offseason, when it's about adding a Pete Alonso, adding an AJ Minter, Jesse Winker, those are pieces you need to be competitive this year. So he will shell out and spend. And we've seen that offseason after offseason. But at some point, there is a desire to be a little bit more reasonable in his spending, because ultimately, he doesn't want to lose money on this team year after year. You want to build up the Mets as a business where he is actually profiting on the team, or at least breaking even. And you can say, oh, all these owners are making money. I think generally around the game, that's absolutely true. Like, you see Tom Ricketts crying poor for the Cubs, and it's ridiculous because they have so much invested in Wrigleyville and everything else that even if their bottom line doesn't look as great for their revenue off of the team, when you think about everything else that comes into the Ricketts pockets around the Cubs, they are making a ton of money. You look at the Mets, though, with the luxury tax payments that Steve Cohen shells out each year, they really aren't making money. They're burning money year over year over year. Now, as Steve Cohen says today, he can finance it, absolutely. But that does not really mean you are just excited to finance it year over year. He said nobody wants to spend money and pay taxes. Those are expensive taxes. So the question then becomes, can the Mets actually get under the Steve Cohen tax line? Obviously, this year, there's no chance. But he did say when asked, where would you like spending to go? He did joke and say, I'd like to get below the Cohen tax. And I think that's probably a little bit of a point of pride for him. They put a tax line into the CBA that was specifically meant to curtail his spending. Now, he has blown past it every year because he's had to, but I think there would be a little point of pride if Cohen could get below that top tax line and still compete and still win. And I think that's the ultimate goal. When you're looking at the Mets payroll right now, they're at $325 million, according to Cohen. He mentioned with IL placements, injured list guys, bringing up minor league players, then adding players to the deadline, so it could easily become a $345 million team, which would be, and already is, a very expensive team. He said that he takes payroll year to year, and he said he could finance it, but he said it's not the most optimal way to run a team. So when you hear all of that, the question really does become, moving forward, how will the Mets continue to operate? Is this going to be the same conversation every single spring training, where Steve Cohen shows up, meets with the media, and says, whoops, I did it again. We blew past our budget? Because that's what he said happened here. They had a budget in mind, and I bet you that budget probably was that Cohen tax line. Let's get to around $300 million. Let's start the year under the line, even if we blow past it or get past it at the trade deadline, because we need to add a piece. And fortunately this year for the Mets, or fortunately, if you think about this roster, they could not get there because you ended up spending $51 million a season on Juan Soto, where they thought maybe it was going to be closer to $40 million. And so that adds up. Maybe you thought that to build out your rotation, you were only going to have to spend, $40 million, but then all of a sudden you spend just that and Clay Holmes and Frankie Montas, and to bring back Sean Manaea, you go over 60 and it just snowballs. So what we're going to talk about in the next segment is future spending. Where are the Mets at for 2026 and beyond? Is there a year where they can actually get that spending below a Cohen tax line? I'm going to talk about that and more in just a minute. First, though, a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Wonderful Pistachios. You're looking for the snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats that help keep you feeling fuller longer. Personally, I love the no shell variety of Wonderful Pistachios because it's the perfect grab and go snack for busy days. I love to throw out my golf bag if I'm going to hit the course. They're also just great on my desk. If I ever get a little bit hungry, crack open the bag, pull out my favorite flavor here, honey roasted. Although there are other flavors to choose from: barbecue, chili roasted, lightly salted. You can find so many. If you like the in shells, they have the in shell variety too. If you love cracking open every shell for that satisfying crunch. Get snacking and cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Stay up to date with all the latest in the world of sports when you check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Our next goal is to get to 13,000 subscribers by opening day. I appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. So let's talk a little bit about the Steve Cohen tax line. This year, the Mets have already blown past it, around $325 million. The luxury tax line is $301. As Steve Cohen said, if they make a trade in season, let's say you pick up Dylan Cease or Sandy Alcantara, you're going to add a significant chunk of payroll, and that's going to bump it up, and you never know what else can happen. So the Mets this year will get nowhere near that Cohen tax line. They have already blown past it, and they're going to continue to blow past it. Let's look at next year, though. The luxury tax will jump in the final year of the CBA to $244 million. This year is $241 million. The Cohen tax line is $60 million above that just general luxury tax line, that first line. So next year, the Cohen tax line will be at $304 million. Look at the Mets payroll. They have $51 million in luxury tax committed to Juan Soto. They have $34.1 million committed to Francisco Lindor. Sean Manaea checks in at 22, or a little bit over that. Brandon Nimmo, a little bit over 20. Clay Holmes, $12.66 million. Jeff McNeil, 12.5. Those are all guaranteed locked-in salaries. Right there, that's just over $152 million. So you're already halfway to the Cohen tax. Now you have to factor in a player option for Pete Alonso at $27 million. Edwin Diaz has an opt-out in his contract. If he opts in, he'll be again at $18.6 million. Frankie Montas has a player option, $17 million. At this point, considering the fact that he's already going to miss time this season, I think you can almost start to expect that he's going to be with the Mets for 2 years. You have Kodai Senga at $15 million. Now, technically, he can opt out, and that's why he's in this section, but there's no chance he will, because to reach that opt-out, he has to get to 400 innings pitched across his first 3 years in a Mets uniform. Because he didn't pitch last year, that means he'd have to throw 228 in the third innings this year, and there's no chance that happens. So really, you can take Senga's $15 million, lock that in. AJ Minter, $11 million. He has a player option on that. So all those guys outside of Senga could conceivably be opt-out, but I think for the most part, you'd expect Diaz to be back. You'd expect Montas to be back. You'd expect Senga to be back. You'd expect Minter potentially to be back, and then Pete Alonso, if he's not back, you're probably going to fill that salary slot with another player at around the same dollar amount. So bottom line here, that is $88.6 million of spending right there that you add on to your guaranteed contracts. You're already at $240 million before you spend a penny. That's not counting arbitration players. That's not counting, again, future spending. That's also not counting the money that is earmarked every year for each team on player benefits, minor league contracts, and the pre-arb bonus pool contributions, which are all part of the CBA. They're all factored into your luxury tax, adds over $23 million to that number. So the Mets right now, their luxury tax payroll, according to Spot Track, heading into the 2026 season is $263.5 million. So they've already blown past the original or the initial tax threshold. And they probably they're actually right up against the first threshold beyond it. So you think about the Mets and trying to get under that line next season. Are they really going to only spend $40 million in free agency? Do we really think that's it? I mean, their rotation would have to just have a ton of success this year. Where you look at next season and you're excited about the Senga, Montas, Holmes, Peterson, McGill rotation because you're going to have to spend in the starting pitching market again. Those guys are going to cost you at least $15 million. You're going to have to spend for relievers. You might have to replace Pete Alonso. You might need a center fielder. Who knows? Who knows what else you're going to have to spend on? So it's pretty unrealistic to think that in this current CBA, the Mets will get under that luxury tax line. The one chance would be if everything breaks right with your development and you have first base covered or first and third base covered between Mark Vientos and somebody else, and Pete Alonso has a great year and walks, and now you have $67 million to spend. Could the Mets fill out their roster with that amount of money? Potentially. But would they actually stay below the line throughout the entire season? It's still sort of doubtful. You look at 2027. We don't know what the CBA will be. We don't know, what that's going to do to spending. Where is that going to put a luxury tax threshold? Is there going to be a luxury tax? Is there going to be a salary cap? Is there going to be a Steve Cohen tax line? We really don't know. But let's just assume that a lot of this current system, continues over. 2027. You have Jeff McNeil, where he will be at a club option of $15.75 million with a $2 million buyout. The Mets will finally get him off the books. Clay Holmes is a $12 million player option if everything works with him as a starting pitcher. Maybe he's gone. Edwin Diaz could have opted out by that point. Pete Alonso would be off the books. Still, the fixed contracts for 2027. Juan Soto, Francisco Lindor, Sean Manaea, Brandon Nimmo, and Kodai Senga. Those guys account for $142 million. At that point, Francisco Alvarez and Mark Vientos, they're going to be in arbitration or they will have signed extensions. Your pitching staff, where are you at? Because you're still going to have to spend there. So if you look at where the Mets are with Juan Soto, with Francisco Lindor, with Brandon Nimmo, and now having Manaea and Senga around still for a couple years, I mean, they have a core in place that is going to be, at least halfway to the tax before you factor in arbitration players, before you factor in that money that's baked into the CBA that you have to spend, and then the free agents that you're going to bring in each year. So every single season, I really do think Steve Cohen is going to show up and say, I had a budget in mind, but oops. Until the Mets win a World Series and he just drastically changes his thinking, and I don't know if Steve Cohen's the type that once he gets that World Series, he's going to say, all right, let's try to make money. I don't know if Steve Cohen has some John Henry in him, and I really don't even know if I should knock John Henry because they had incredible success in Boston, but recently they haven't been spending. They just signed Alex Bregman, but 2 or 3 year deal, so it's not necessarily committing long-term on spending. We'll see. We'll see how things evolve over time, but all of this does lead me towards the conversation that I want to have in the final segment. Because ultimately, if the Mets are going to be financially responsible, the things that have to happen, they have to be able to develop their own pitching. Filling out the rotation with cost-controlled arms, filling out the bullpen with cost-control arms will go a long way. They have to identify their homegrown players that they should lock up to those pre-arb extensions we see teams like the Braves really employ, where you get some of these guys, you sign them to a deal, and now they are at a fixed cost. They might make a little bit more money during arbitration, but you can buy some of their free agent years where instead of spending $25, $30 million on a player, you're spending in the high teens potentially. So will they do that with Alvarez and Vientos at some point? I think that's obviously a part of this equation. But do the Mets really have another monster salary slot? Because there's been a lot of discussion today about Vladimir Guerrero Jr. because the extension deadline passed and the Blue Jays were not able to come to terms on a deal. And so that has led some Mets fans to say, all right, we'll enjoy Pete for one more year. Hopefully he opts out and Vladdy comes in. Are the Mets really going to spend on Vladimir Guerrero Jr.? Steve Cohen was asked about it. He had an interesting comment. So I want to play that comment. I want to talk about it. We'll go through it all in just a minute. First, though, a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Select Quote. In sports, having a winning strategy is everything. It's how the best teams make it to the World Series. And the same goes for life. Having a strategy like life insurance from Select Quote can protect your financial legacy and keep your family's future secure. Select Quote makes it easy to find the perfect life insurance policy. As one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience, they've helped over 2 million customers find $700 billion in coverage since 1985. What sets Select Quote apart is their personal touch. Unlike other brokers that offer one-size-fits-all policies, their licensed agents tailor coverage to fit your unique needs. And it's more affordable than you think. You can get up to $1 million in coverage for as little as $20 a month. Get the right life insurance for you for less at selectquote.com/lockedon. Go to selectquote.com/lockedon today to get started. That's selectquote.com/lockedon. Select Quote, they shop, you save. If you are an everyday listener to the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service. You'll get updates from me anytime news breaks on the Mets. You can ask me questions anytime. You can also take part in our Locked On Mets signed photo giveaways. If you want to be Locked On Mets insider, find a link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. Now, the big news of the day when it came to Major League Baseball is the fact that Vladimir Guerrero Jr. did not sign an extension with the Blue Jays. He had set an arbitrary line in the sand. Once we report to camp, that's the deadline to sign me to an extension. If we don't come to terms, I will go to free agency. So Vladdy will be a free agent next year. Now, how much does he want? What we know is in December, Vladimir Guerrero was on a podcast, and he said the Blue Jays had offered him $340 million, and that was, quote, nowhere close to my number. He referenced how Shohei Ohtani changed the game for Juan Soto, and Juan Soto just changed the game for me. He wants big, big money. The Blue Jays reportedly upped their offer. We don't know how much they upped their offer. We'll see if they leak that as a way to sort of appease the fans and be like, hey, we tried, but they could not come to terms. I would think the starting point for Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is $400 million. There's a chance that he actually wants $500+ million. He will hit free agency at 27 years old, or technically 26, but going into his age 27 season as he has a March birthday. So, the question really becomes, are the Mets willing to spend on another guy like this? Fans are clamoring for it. You see some talking heads that are continuing to beat this drum that the Mets should get Vladdy. Vladdy's the answer. Soto, Vladdy. That's your team. That's your squad. I've made my case on this, and if you listen to the show throughout the offseason, you know where I stand. And I did an entire show comparing Vladdy to Pete Alonso and why Pete is the better investment, not because he's a better player, but because he's eventually going to get more reasonable salaries because the market is not going to overpay him because he's at his prime age when he signs, where he fits this window a lot better than Vladdy. And I get into that, and I'll reference some of it again today. But Steve Cohen was asked about Vladdy today because he was referencing Juan Soto, and he said, this is a generational player. You don't get these opportunities often. He said it might have been a while before someone of that category would come available again. And naturally, one of the reporters said, oh, but didn't you hear, Steve? Vladimir Guerrero Jr. did not sign his extension. He's going to be available. This is what Steve Cohen had to say about it.
Vlad Guerrero Jr. turned down the extension for the Blue Jays, and he'll be available next offseason.
Yeah, he's a great ball player, and once again, I'll worry about that next year. Obviously with payroll considerations, and you really can't have. You can't have too many long-term contracts because then you lose your roster flexibility. So you got to be really careful. But I'll let my baseball people make that decision.
Steve, you mentioned
So you have to be careful when it comes to roster flexibility. I've talked about that a lot. This build should be about Juan Soto and Francisco Lindor. You don't necessarily need a third player in that payroll tier to build out a great team, especially when you still have Brandon Nimmo that's part of this window that's making $20 million a season for 6 more years. I mean, he's on the books until I think 2030. So I think it's actually 5 more years, but you're was an 8-year deal. He's played what? 23, 24. Oh yeah, so no, it's still got 6 years left. But let's hear what David Stearns has to say about this, because he was on a podcast a couple weeks ago and he was talking about the Soto contract, how this was, the guy to spend on. This was a generational talent at a prime age who has done incredible things leading into free agency. Here's the guy that you should spend on. And he talked about only maybe having one player at that level, only one generational contract on the books.
Regardless of how deep an organization's pockets are, you can't do multiple of these. In terms of these generational type of contracts, you probably have one shot to shoot. And we felt that this was the right person to take that shot.
So you hear both Cohen and Stearns, the two main decision makers for the New York Mets, in line on the idea that having multiple generational contracts is probably not in the cards, especially when you think about the fact you still have the biggest contract ever given to a shortstop on your books. And fans want this. It's this idea that the Mets are gearing up for Vladdy. They signed Pete to a short-term deal because of Vladdy. And I'm telling you that you're flatly wrong. That, sure, they're going to explore the market, and a lot can change in a year. Maybe the Mets really are in a position where they feel like their lineup wasn't good enough, and they have to add one big bat, and this is the bat to add. Maybe the market isn't there for Vladdy, and he wants 400, but that's not on the table. And you stay involved in the conversation just to see where the bidding goes. But here's what I want to do. I'm going to read you OPSs from 2019 through 2024 on 3 different players, and you just tell me which one stands out. So the first guy, OPS in 2019, 772, 2020, 791, 2021, 1002 or 1.002, 2022, 818, 2023, 788, 2024, 940. Next guy we got, OPS in 2019, 941, OPS in 2020, 817, 2021, 863, 2022, 869, 2023, 821, last year, 2024, 788. Then you have another guy, 2019, 949, 2020, 1.185, 2021, 999, 2022, 853, 2023, 930, 2024, 989. Which of those 3 guys stands out? It was obviously the last one. That last one is Juan Soto. That's who you give generational money to. And then when you look at the other guys, it was Vladdy and Pete. You look at the years that Vladdy has had a better OPS than Pete Alonso. 2021, he had an OPS over 1,000. But 2019 and 2020, Pete had a better OPS. 2022, Pete had a better OPS. 2023, Pete had a better OPS. 2024, last year, Vladdy had a significantly better OPS. I'm not saying that Vladdy isn't a better hitter than Pete Alonso. He certainly is. But when it comes to being a power hitter, the argument's definitely in Pete's favor based on the numbers that he's put up. He is a better home run hitter, the better run producer. But, Vladdy's younger and he can continue to evolve in those categories. The thing about it is, if Vladdy signs a $400 million deal and it's 10 years long, he's $40 million per season. And you already got Juan Soto, Lindor, Nimmo. You add in Vladdy to the mix. 4 guys are going to make $145 million. And that's assuming that he gets 400, not 500. Are the Red Sox going to be all in on Vladdy? There's been some rumblings they might want to be. The Blue Jays, will they be in the conversation next year? Potentially. Who else gets into the fray? We don't know. The Yankees have a vacancy at first base. This can turn into Red Sox Yankees. Do you want to swim in those waters again? Because those are the same waters you were in for Juan Soto. You got the better player. Now this is the consolation prize. Do you want the consolation prize too? Here's the thing. You don't want Pete Alonso past 31. You want Vladdy into his late 30s? And you talk about long-term contracts locking up your roster flexibility. You sign Vladdy to a 10-year deal. You're paying for, 27. Then you go deep into the 30s. Next winter, where are the Mets at is the question. Maybe Ryan Clifford is knocking on the door to be your first baseman. Top prospect, ton of power. He might be close. Maybe Jesus Baez, your top third base prospect right now, who ended the year in high A. He got hurt. Otherwise, I think he might have really continued to show what he did in low A and thrived in high A. And maybe this year he's starting in double A, but still, that guy has a lot of promise. Where is he at in a year? Where's Jet Williams at? Where's Ronnie Mauricio at? Where's Brett Beatty at? Did Mark Vientos prove this year that he could hold down third base and be the answer at that position for a long time? Or did he prove that he's not good enough there and he's got to slide over to first or DH? A lot will happen from this year, and we still don't know the season Pete Alonso has. Pete could have a bad year, opt in, and then where are you? Are you really going to have both Pete Alonso and Vladdy on the same payroll? So there's a lot that has to be answered in this year. We still don't know if Vladdy's going to have a season like 21 and 24, or if he's going to have a season like any other years of his career where he hasn't been an elite hitter. I look at the Mets, and I look at their future, and I think that you have 5-year windows with Juan Soto. This first 5-year window is a 5-year window with Brandon Nimmo and Francisco Lindor at the forefront. And adding another player into the mix, I think you want that player to fit into that 5-year window. So after this 5-year window, where Brandon Nimmo is going into his last year and Lindor has a couple left, and you're getting ready to transition to the next era of Mets baseball around Juan Soto, who will be going into his age 31 season, you can get another awesome guy to pair with him. And I would rather hold my chips so 5 years from now, I can be in the market for Ellie De La Cruz. I can be in the market for Gunnar Henderson, Scott Boras clients who most likely will get to the market at that time, guys that probably won't sign pre-arb extensions, who are shortstops, who are elite athletes that can either move Lindor off of short at that point when he's in his, mid to late 30s, slide him to second base potentially, or guys that can play third base potentially. Ellie De La Cruz is such a good athlete, you could put him anywhere on the field. I would believe in him. Gunnar hits free agency in 2029, Ellie in 2030. Those are the players to target for the second window of Juan Soto. I wouldn't lock in another player for that second window of Juan Soto. I would be looking at guys that can thrive in this short window. I'd be looking at the players that you can sign to shorter term deals. And yes, I am a Pete Alonso stan. I will always be here, banging the drum that Pete Alonso should be part of this window of Mets baseball. Because I think Pete Alonso, when it's all said and done and he finally locks into the next deal, I don't think he's going to make north of $25 million a season. I think that's the best he will do. The best case scenario for Pete, has a great year and somebody puts 5 years, 125 on the table. And guess what? If another team does that, he's going to bring that contract to the Mets. And the Mets will have a decision to make. And they might say, no thanks. They might say, okay, we'll give you 125, but we're going to defer a bunch of money. Who knows? Who knows where this goes with Pete Alonso or the rest of this team? But I would not be counting on Vladimir Guerrero Jr. in a Mets uniform. It is a pipe dream. It does not go in line with what David Stearns has said, what Steve Cohen has said, and what is a realistic future for this team. Because the thing you have to remember, Juan Soto is not the Gold Glover he wishes to be in a corner outfield spot. He said he wants to get there. It's not realistic to think that Juan Soto is ever going to be a consistently great defender. Can he trick the metrics for a year and potentially win that Gold Glove due to his name value? He's gotten finalist nominations a couple of times based on largely his name value. So maybe he does get there, but he's never going to be a guy that's going to stick in a corner outfield spot for 15 years. No chance. 10 years, maybe. More likely, if you get 6 or 7 of Juan Soto in right field, I am thrilled if he spends half of this contract in the outfield. Juan Soto has followed Bryce Harper's career, basically to a T. And he got traded a couple times before free agency. I guess the Nationals wised up there when they only got a comp pick for Bryce Harper. But you talk about production, rookie of the year, all that stuff, debuting as a teenager for the Nationals. It's all been pretty in line. Bryce Harper spent his first full season at first base last year. He was 31. Juan Soto, after this 5-year window, when he enters age 31, he might be a first baseman himself. He might be a DH. You don't want to lock your 2 highest salary players on guys that don't have a solid position, guys that aren't good defenders. The Mets have it perfect right now. Enjoy what they have. Their top 2 salary guys, one guy who ultimately is always going to bring the value defensively, and that's Francisco Lindor at the most premium position, and a generational bat that is significantly better than the bat the Mets fans are pining for next. Significantly better. So let's appreciate the year that we're about to enjoy and the window of Juan Soto and Francisco Lindor in their primes. These are the two best players on the Mets, and you don't need to get a hitter or a player that's better than Lindor. You can build this year by year around these guys. Keep your roster flexibility and know, oh, this year we need to get more pitching. This year we need to get a center fielder, and you can find ways to make it all work. Locking yourself into Vladdy does not make sense. It's a hill I'll die on, but it's one that I hope to not broach again until next year, because the Vladdy, discussion right now is going to come to end with these extension talks being over. And unless the Blue Jays fall out of the mix entirely and Vladdy is available at the deadline, this is not going to be a topic for a little bit. And I committed to not spending more time on this on the show, but there was so much dialogue today, and it coincided with Steve Cohen getting asked about it. I had to do it one last time. So I appreciate all of you who tuned in before and tuned into this one, and we'll tune into future shows of Locked On Mets as we continue to gear up for the 2025 season. As always, make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets if you want to be Locked On Mets Insider. Find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/Locked On Mets. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first watch, or your first listen to your first watch every day. And then for your second watch, head over to YouTube and check out the first ever 24/7 streaming channel that covers everything in the world of sports. We're talking about Locked On Sports today with our local hosts from each team, league-wide hosts from each league. Find Locked On Sports today streaming 24/7 on YouTube.